My name is Doug Mueller. I'm Director of MSU Ag Bio Research and Assistant Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies, and I'm really excited to be part of this event this afternoon. When we kicked off Food at MSU and started thinking about this, I think one of the things that we really decided to do was not to shy away from difficult topics, because the whole idea of this was to try to take on some of these more complex topics in an integrated and really a well-rounded way. And the basis of all of this is really trying to be better listeners. And so if we're going to understand what's going on, we have to listen to our friends and our critics as well. And so I'm really excited about this, and it's interesting. Part of this is a follow-up to the recent issues of Futures that we put out on GMOs. And you always kind of wonder, have you hit the mark? Well, I got comments ranging from, well, it's about time MSU did something like this, to when in the hell are you going to quit jamming GMOs down our throat? So I think we must have hit the mark, because we irritated people on both sides. But anyway, it's really great to have you here. Again, we really are excited about moving forward in some of these areas and listening more to people. So with that, let me turn the microphone over to Cheryl Kirschenbaum, who is the host of the event. Cheryl?
Well, thank you so much, Doug, and thank you all for coming and joining us today in Ag Bio Research and Food at MSU. And I'm especially excited to be talking about genetically modified foods, because of all of the different topics that we've covered, from food access to food security, food safety, even food and culture. I think we by far get the most questions related to genetically modified foods, questions related to gene editing, what some of the research is, why we do it. And so that was the rationale behind bringing together this great group of panelists and having a conversation with our community. And before we kind of make introductions and kick this off, I'm just curious, because we can't unfortunately ask everyone to tell us why they're here. Raise your hand if you are here because you work in some level or in some way on research related to GMOs. I'd say well more than a handful. Raise your hand if you're here because you have some concerns about genetically modified foods. Okay. And who's, I guess we'll call it GMO curious? All right, it's probably our biggest group so far. Well, I'm glad you're here. Our table is more meant to be a conversation with community than you guys listening to me yammering on. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, asking a few questions, and then turning the mics over to you, because we want to have a nice back and forth and time for questions and answers. So without further ado, to get started, I'll just introduce our panelists. To my left, we have Dr. Paul Thompson. He is the Kellogg Chair in Agricultural, Food, and Community Ethics. We have Dr. Alison Bernstein, who happens to be my friend, also assistant professor at MSU and part of SciMoms, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about here tonight. We also have Jennifer Carter Johnson, associate professor at MSU's College of Law, and Felicia Wu, who is the Hanna Distinguished Professor in MSU's Department of Ag, Food, and Resource Economics. And she's also part of MSU's Food Science program. So Felicia, I'm going to start with you. I was hoping we could kind of kick off by just giving you some time to tell the audience a little bit about what GMOs are, and also how they're tested, whether we should be worried, and how we're using them.
I would be happy to do that, Cheryl. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. Actually, the very question about what constitutes what GMOs are has been under a lot of debate. In the scientific term, GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are organisms like plants, animals, bacteria, in which humans have deliberately inserted a gene that was not originally part of that organism in order to confer some sort of trait that that organism did not originally have. Now, you might have heard some of the arguments about, oh, we've been genetically modifying organisms for 10,000 or more years. And to some extent, that's true. Ever since the dawn of agriculture, we've been deliberately breeding particular crops and even some animals in order to confer the traits that we wanted, that the food would be more edible, that it would be more resistant to various diseases and to the climate. But it wasn't until, recombinant DNA became a technological option in the 1970s, that we actually began to talk about taking genes from other organisms and then deliberately inserting them into a host organism to produce a particular trait that we wanted. You were asking about how GMOs are regulated in the United States. There was a decision made in 1986 by the Office of Science and Technology Policy that the existing laws, the existing acts, were sufficient in order to regulate GMOs. And those particular acts are carried out by 3 agencies of the United States: the US Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the US Food and Drug Administration. So they have a variety of different acts and different policies by which they test for the safety of GMOs before they are allowed to be sold in the market.
Well, Paul, you were recently interviewed and featured in the AgBio Research Futures magazine, talking a bit about public perception of genetically modified foods. So I thought it would be great to ask you about the disconnect in how people think about agriculture, their food, and the environment.
Well, it's a big topic. I mean, I think there's been certainly a shift over my lifetime in terms of how well people are connected to agriculture and what their sense of where their food is actually coming from. I have had students, I know no one in this room is like this, but I have had students, when I showed them a picture of a potato, they literally thought it came from a factory. They did not know that it came out of the ground. So we are now living in a culture where many people really don't have a sense of where food comes from, and they don't really have much of a sense of agriculture as its source. And I would also say that over the course of my lifetime, we've seen a loss of confidence in agriculture. Maybe these two things go together, maybe they don't. But certainly when I was growing up and going through college, we would hear a lot of confidence in farmers as particularly upright, good stewards. And we've seen a number of changes in agriculture, most of them actually not having anything to do with genetic engineering, that have undercut that confidence. And I think the separation that people have from agriculture has made them less trustful of agriculture and its institutions. We have massive food corporations all along the supply chain. We're down to just a few major grocery store chains. And I think that it's very easy to look out at the food system today and see lots of brand names and corporate structures, and not look out and think about that neighbor farmer down the road that you could have a conversation with.
Well, at Food at MSU, one of our projects is running a national survey looking at American attitudes on a whole variety of food topics. We just released the results from our last wave of the poll about 2 weeks ago. And we found, among other things, that more than half of Americans say they rarely or never look into where their food came from and how it was produced, which is right along the lines of what you're talking about. And so it's no wonder that we wind up being very confused about how it impacts our health and our environment. But turning to you, Alison, and I didn't mention this earlier, but Alison is a neuroscientist, and she focuses some of her work on toxicology. And here she is at this table talking about genetically modified foods. And also, I'm particularly interested in your story as a parent, because I think that that's really informed a lot of your work and a lot of the style of science communication that you've been involved in. So I think, given this audience might not be familiar with Sci Moms or Science Moms, you could talk a little bit about how that got started and how it relates to GMOs.
So my science communication journey really started in 2008 when I was pregnant with my daughter, who's now 10, which is crazy. But when I was pregnant with her, there was a lot in the news about BPA, and I was just scared of everything. Like, I thought the baby bottles were going to kill her, and the pesticide residues were going to make her sick. And so I would like sit in the grocery store with these printouts of like, what food could I give her? What couldn't I give her? I had massive arguments with my parents because they gave her regular box mac and cheese instead of organic box mac and cheese, which looking back is a little silly of an argument. But so I was really miserable. My anxiety was through the roof. And so I really started reading a lot, and luckily I have a science background, so I could approach it with a little bit more rationality than perhaps my anxiety would have let me. So then in 2011, I started a Facebook page called Mommy PhD, and I started talking about GMOs and pesticides and vaccines and all sorts of science-related issues that parents talk about. And then I started working with a group of women, and we were featured in a documentary called Science Moms. That we actually had a screening of in this building in March, and Cheryl led that panel as well. And then so since then, we've launched like a spin-off project called SciMoms, and we really try to provide parents who have questions about these issues with reliable information from reliable sources, because when you go online, it's really confusing and there's so much misinformation. So we're really trying to be a place where people can come have a conversation and to gather information all together.
It's neat. Definitely a website to visit if you get a chance. Jennifer? I really enjoyed reading about food labels with regard to you in the Futures magazine, so I wanted to touch on that a bit while we have you here tonight. We found also in our polling, 60% of consumers say they're looking at food labels, even though the terms most popular that are most appealing to consumers tend to be things like clean and natural, which are frankly pretty meaningless. So I want to talk a little bit about non-GMO labels specifically, GMO-free. I mean, I see them on everything from water to produce to salt. I thought you could talk a little bit about how they're used and what that certification means.
So thanks again for having me as well. Food labeling for GMO is a rapidly changing area. So you have the gamut from the new bioengineered labeling requirements that are in the process of coming out to label things that do have GMOs in them, versus the GMO-free label, which is a certification mark that's not government regulated, but it's actually something that a private group puts out. And so the way that that works is they have set up a list of criteria as to how you source and make food. And if you can show that you fit that criteria, you're allowed to use their mark, which is just like any other trademark. It's a Nike, it's a Michigan State, it's a trademark, it's a brand. But what it denotes is that you've met their standards. And so their standards are one definition of what it means to be GMO-free. So it covers everything from whether there were genetically modified foods in the product, to whether the animals, if there's a meat product, were they fed GMO grains or not. And so it's a pretty far-ranging idea as to what GMOs are. The problem, I think, comes in when you start seeing it on things like salt or water, which are not things that there is any possibility of there being a genetically modified, because they're not organic in any sense of the word. And so a lot of companies have jumped on the certification mark as a way to get the public to say, well, this has the GMO-free mark and this doesn't, so I better buy the GMO-free version, even though the one that's not marked doesn't have GMOs either. And so you start to see companies playing games with these marks, and that can sometimes be a bit of a concern.
And sometimes affects prices as well.
Oh, it affects prices, it affects fear, because if you see one type of salt labeled as GMO-free and not the other, does that mean that the other has genetically modified constituents? So yes,
Yeah.
all labels, yes.
Well, we are not just here to celebrate GMO foods. We want to have a real conversation about them. And rather than thinking of them as a product, they really are a kind of tool. It's how that tool is used. And to be fair, there have been some bad actors producing products that might have had an impact on the environment or elsewhere. So, Felicia, I wanted to ask you a little bit, and I guess there's some different ways to interpret this, but how do we ensure that that tool is used in a safe way, in a way that we don't have to be worried about? How can we ensure that GM technology is used responsibly?
That's a great question, Cheryl. It's largely in the hands of the biotech industries and the governmental agencies that regulate the safety of GMOs. So for a little bit of background, I had mentioned to you earlier that it's the USDA, the FDA, and the EPA that regulate GM food safety in the United States. Since there are so many of you who are knowledgeable about GMOs in this room, you probably know that back in 1992, the Food and Drug Administration made the decision that genetically modified foods are substantially equivalent to non-GM foods. And as such, they were granted GRAS status, generally recognized as safe. And therefore, industry was not required to have any sort of mandatory food safety inspection with FDA prior to the food coming on the market. Now, of course, this was a bit disturbing to a large portion of the population in the US who knew that this was happening at the time. And biotech industry, of course, caught on to this and said, well, we know that this is a source of some contention. Nonetheless, they are undergoing voluntary consultation with the FDA whenever they want to put out a new genetically modified food into our grocery stores. In addition to FDA regulating food safety, the Environmental Protection Agency, where I worked before, does the same thing, but that's only for genetically modified foods that are producing their own pesticides. So I worked in the EPA Biopesticides and Pollution Prevention Division. And aside from doing all of the ecosystem safety tests, so we were testing safety on earthworms, honeybees, terrestrial and marine animals, estuarine animals, multiple different species. We were also looking at human health risk assessment. So we looked at the toxicity, the carcinogenicity, and the allergenicity, all of these different genetically modified pesticide-producing plants that were coming to us. We did tests of allergenicity, for example, or we looked at the test that industry submitted on whether a food was likely to be an allergen. Since up until now, you have not seen any labels in the grocery store saying there is genetically modified food in this particular product, what if that food was producing a novel allergen? Anytime you introduce a new gene into a food product, it is in fact producing a new protein, and we could be allergic to these proteins. So it's very, very careful to make sure that these proteins that are being produced by GMOs don't cause allergic reactions in humans who don't even know that they're consuming this novel protein. We do those allergenicity tests, we do various different toxicity tests, and other ways to ensure food safety.
Okay, well, so this technology is being used, and beyond that GMO-free label, I've seen a lot about a new label called, it's going to say Bioengineered.
Yes.
I've seen a whole bunch of mock-ups of what it might look like. If anyone here has had a chance to take a look, my favorite is this happy little sunshine, because I don't even know what to make of it, I'm going to be honest. But turning back to you, Jennifer, what are your thoughts on that kind of labeling, and do you think it's useful, or do you think it complicates matters even more?
I think it's complicated, because for some people it will be a signal to not buy something, and for some people it will just be a happy little smiling BE label, and they'll keep buying something. It's going to be a mark like anything else, kind of like the counter to the GMO free. The problem is, I think, lies in what are our definitions of what does it mean to have bioengineered food, what does it mean to be GMO free, and is there something that falls in the middle? For instance, One of the new technologies that we hear about being used in bioengineered foods is CRISPR, which is a way to very easily and precisely go in and make, instead of inserting a gene, make point mutations to take genes out. And I'll leave it to some more people to talk about the technology. But it's a lot safer in the sense that we can go in and very specifically make some of these changes. The other thing is it doesn't leave behind, like some of the old technologies would leave behind bacterial remnants from the process. So it doesn't. It really leaves the cells looking non-transgenic to begin with, or non-GMO to begin with. And so is that a genetically engineered, is that a bioengineered crop, if something comes from that? And that's actually something that the agencies are struggling with right now. So it's something that, we're going in and we're actually marketing, we're making changes, but it doesn't look like it falls under the current labeling laws. So I think making the definitions across all of these labels is really going to be one of the hardest things, because until we do that, consumers can see BE or they can see GMO free, but it doesn't tell them anything. And so I think that's one of the big problems that we have with labeling overall, that the BE label is just going to highlight.
And you're touching on some big policy issues,
Yes.
which I think are important to consider, because here we are thinking about the policies in terms of how we label food, what the definition of bioengineered is, what the definition of genetic modification means in terms of labeling. But we also saw with that survey that I keep talking about that 49% of, so I should preface this by saying the poll itself isn't full of gotcha questions, but we include one question each wave of the poll just to get a general sense of science literacy, or food science literacy broadly. And so on this past wave that we just got back, and this is over 2,000 Americans age 18 and over, weighted in a whole bunch of different ways to reflect US Census demographics. So it's pretty representative. But one of the things we saw, this one question we had, was whether people thought that foods containing deoxyribonucleic acid should be labeled, or essentially DNA. And 49% of respondents said yes, all food with deoxyribonucleic acid should be labeled, which gets at some other issues too, like how chemical names sound very scary. But it points out that most consumers aren't even necessarily clear on what DNA is, and yet we're having these very high-level conversations about related topics to that. And so I think what we're seeing as a result is, the public hasn't really, consumers haven't been on board as all these conversations are taking place, and that's a real problem, especially in terms of food literacy. And I didn't mean to, Alison, did you want to add something?
Yeah,
before?
I had, just from the parenting side of things and the parent in the store when it comes to the labels, like, I always like to think of these things from a risk framework, like what are these telling me about my risks? And I look at those labels where it doesn't tell me anything at all about how that was grown, what pesticides were used, the relative safety, the relative risks of that product. And so I think it just confuses the whole thing, and it doesn't actually help inform people and empower them to make good decisions.
And I think we see that not just with labels. I mean, we see this with all sorts of labels, right? Like how all of a sudden gluten-free is like half the size of a lot of boxes because people are willing to pay more for it regardless of whether they need that or not. But that's a different hour table.
Though similarly, there's a lot of things that are labeled as gluten-free that never had gluten in them to begin with. And so you have those sorts of buying decisions being made, again, based on the labels, not necessarily on the food themselves.
Right, and consumers are generally willing to pay more for those labels, not understanding or not recognizing that often gluten-free foods are higher in sugars, fats, and salts. So it may not be all that healthier if that's why you think you're purchasing them. Some people are gluten sensitive though, so it's important to indicate when it's necessary. But turning back to Paul, who's been much too silent lately, we're seeing that land-grant universities broadly have been pretty enthusiastic about genetically modified foods, but I know that you've discussed that the structure of how funding and research happens does cause some divisions in related programs. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about that and maybe where you see some opportunities for bridge building and more effective communication.
Well, I think that, you know, sometimes it hasn't been, I've been at 3 land-grant universities. I started my career at Texas A&M, and I spent about 7 years at Purdue before I came to Michigan State. And I'd say at all 3 places, there are faculty within the College of Agriculture that won't talk to each other. And it's the GMO issue that's really dividing them. It's not so much that they have contrasting views about the safety of GMOs, but I think some of the people that are working in organics and, you know, more, you know, kind of biocontrol, different kinds of system, you know, they look over there at the salaries and the startup costs that the biotech scientists are getting, and they'd say, you know, man, I'd like to have a tenth of that. And you know, they just don't feel like that that the grant money or the institutional support is there for alternatives to GMOs. And I think that that has created some serious division within colleges of agriculture. You know, I think we maybe have done better at Michigan State than some other places, but we have some of those issues here at Michigan State too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely something we might talk a little more about when we open this up for questions. Alison, as someone who I think would call yourself among your many hats a science communicator, with a lot of experience communicating about genetically modified foods to the public, I thought maybe I could ask you a little bit about what your experience has been and how you might advise we address consumer concerns, because I mean, people are concerned because they care about their health and their safety, and they're coming from, I think, a pretty pure place most of the time. So what can we in the science community do to improve public understanding of GMOs? And I also just want to, as an aside, one of the first times I heard Alison talk, someone involved with SciMoms was pointing out how you often see things about GMOs with a needle as the graphic of reference.
It's in the movie, and
Yeah.
they filmed me doing a Google search for what is a GMO. And like it was a Google image search, and like none of the pictures are accurate. And they're all tomatoes, and there's no GMO tomato on the market. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was what that was. So I think the most important thing, if you're going to have a conversation, is to acknowledge that people's concerns are valid. And I see too many times online that people are just like, ugh, why are you concerned about GMOs? You're anti-science. No, someone doesn't have the knowledge. They have a question. It's a valid concern because it's something that people don't know about. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to be honest, because too many times people are like, this is the information and GMOs are fine and there's no issue, and they do this with pesticides too. There are risks. And you have to be honest about those risks. You have to be honest about the limits of your own personal knowledge, the limits of scientific knowledge, because science doesn't know everything. It's just a method to help us understand things. So I think being honest and validating people's concerns that's how you start that conversation, and then you have that foundation to move forward.
And if you look at the history of science in this country, I think generally the public has a fair reason to be somewhat skeptical or nervous about science, because science has been responsible for some egregious things in the past and probably now as well. But I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to let you guys have some time, because you're not here to hear me talk. Felicia, you mentioned why we're using GMOs in agriculture, but we haven't talked at all about what we're already eating. Again, in our survey, we see a lot of people don't realize most of us eat GM foods every day. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what we're already eating, and a little bit about what your research on transgenic BT corn is about, and the potential for foods in the developing world like golden rice.
I'd be glad to do that. And I'm assuming that you're asking about what proportion of the food that we typically American consumers eat that's actually genetically modified.
Sure.
Right, okay. So unless you specifically purchase any sort of organic tofu or organic soy milk, or any organic edamame, the Japanese name for the soybeans. Close to 100% of the soybeans that we consume in the United States are genetically modified, specifically Roundup Ready soybeans. Soybeans that have been genetically modified to tolerate the herbicide glyphosate. And that is the case with, close to 100% of the soybean and soy products that we consume. Same with soy sauce. As far as field corn is concerned, and I'm separating field corn from sweet corn, so there's a bit of a difference. We consume field corn in the form of corn flakes, corn tortillas, corn chips, corn grits, cornmeal. Again, close to 100% of those corn products in the United States are genetically modified. And that is a combination of, again, Roundup Ready corn that's modified to tolerate the herbicide glyphosate, or it's what's called BT corn, which is the transgenic crop that I've worked with the most. And this is a type of corn that's genetically modified to produce its own pesticide, particularly crystal proteins, in the corn, such that when an insect attempts to consume the corn, some part of the corn, either the root or the kernels, it will there's a toxic reaction in the insect's gut, and it stops feeding and usually dies. And that's a very commonly planted type of genetically modified corn in the US today. So a lot of my work in the area of genetically modified BT corn has been on the fact that because it controls for insect damage, it is less likely to be infected by fungi, by molds, and therefore it's less likely to have what are called mycotoxins, or toxins that are produced by fungi that colonize our food crops. So this was known ever since the 1990s that genetically modified BT corn had lower levels of a toxin called fumonisin in the United States, and that has been linked with neural tube defects in babies. It's been linked somewhat tenuously to esophageal cancer, and now it's being linked to growth impairment in children. So we've really reduced the levels of fumonisin in US corn. My current research is looking to see whether BT corn also reduces aflatoxin, or has lower levels of aflatoxin, which has been recognized for over 50 years as being a very potent liver carcinogen. The International Agency for Research on Cancer calls it a group 1 known human liver carcinogen, and that also has been implicated in a lot of different liver diseases aside from liver cancer.
You might want to also mention that BT is toxic to caterpillars, but not to mammals. You didn't say that.
Oh, in case there was any concern. No, that's a great point. That the crystal proteins that are produced in BT corn are toxic either to Lepidopteran species, so these include European corn borer, corn earworm, or to Coleopteran species, so these are the beetles, including corn rootworm. But they are not toxic to mammals, to fish, to birds, to earthworms, to most other species.
Okay. Well, I know I said that was my last question, but I have one more thing I wanted to just ask the group, because it comes up a lot in questions that I get. As people working on kind of the science behind GMOs, do you feel that those in favor, who take more of a positive look at the prospects and possibilities for genetically modified foods, is that mutually exclusive from organic farming? Can both work together? What are your thoughts? Because I think there's a conception that they are mutually exclusive, and I know I'm answering my own question, but I know personally I think that they both have
They're
value.
exclusive in the sense that if it's organic, it can't use a GMO. That's actually part of what's written into the organic standard. But I know a lot of farmers that are growing a field of BT corn, and across the road they're growing a field of organic corn. And so there are lots of farmers who will, produce both systems. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think they're compatible. I do think that some of the next generation biotechnologies, it would sure be nice to be able to use them under the organic system. I think some of the things that are in the pipeline are disease-resistant plants that you actually would be able to grow without using pesticides, and it would sure be nice for organic farmers to be able to use them. But that will take a change in the organic standard, and a change in the organic standard will take a bit of a change in the culture of people who are currently seeking out organic food.
I would agree with exactly what Paul was saying, because to me, pesticides are more of a concern than GMO, from my perspective. And I would love to be able to have an organic option that had GMOs, because I don't care about the GMO perspective, but I do care more about knowing what kind of pesticides are used. And some of the things like BT corn, they have the pesticide in them, so that you have more of be able to use those with organic farming.
Actually, yeah, another thing you didn't mention, Felicia, is that BT is approved for organic production if it's not incorporated into the plant through GMO. BT is one of the pesticides that is approved for organic production, so it's considered to be a very safe.
The exclusion of GMO from organic to me is very frustrating, because I work on pesticide toxicity, so I like anything that helps us use less pesticide. And so like even with Roundup Ready crops, like you actually use less toxic and less volume of total pesticides with a Roundup Ready crop, and that's something that a certain segment of the farming population just won't even consider for basically an arbitrary reason. But it's a tool that would help us use less pesticides.
The other thing to consider from a legal perspective, so this is really Jenny's bailiwick, is that if organic is supposed to be separated from GMOs, but all of these new biotechnologies actually are not technically GMOs, like CRISPR-Cas9 or even RNA interference crops, is there the possibility that those particular types of biotech crops could be in sync with what's considered organic agricultural production? That's another possibility.
Right. And then how will that work as different countries have different policies on what a GMO is and how that's regulated, which I think is something we're really trying to grapple with already.
And if we're having issues thinking about it up here, what does that mean for the consumer?
Right.
In light of everything else. So
I think it's also important when you think about organic as a consumer, the practices that are in organic can also be adopted by non-organic farmers. Like organic farmers are not the only farmers who use cover crops and IPM, and here's where I'm not a farmer and I've stepped out of my, so there are things that organic farmers can use that anyone can use, and it's really only through the exclusion of certain types of pesticides and genetic engineering that makes that different. So, and I think encouraging all farmers to adopt some of these techniques with the option of the technology that we've demonstrated through regulatory processes are safe, or as safe as other food, then you build a good food system.
which could help bring the two pieces of the research strategy back together, because then it's not we're funding one thing or the other, it's how do we get these systems to work together.
So who has questions?
Okay, you did that. Nice.
Someone should have a mic. We should have a couple mic runners out there. Okay.
Okay,
And
my question.
Tell us also your name and.
Okay, my name is Gary Brinkman. I'm a field agronomist for Pioneer Hybrid. I deal very much in GMO products and live day to day with those technologies actually since 1982. My question is, you mentioned the idea of possibly bringing together organic and, biotechnology farmers. It doesn't seem like that's ever going to happen, but my question is it possible to find a middle road with a new label that might suggest environmentally sustainable, safe food, that might eliminate some of the hostility on each side? Do you ever see anything like that? Is anyone trying to generate a middle ground? There's so much money to be made currently in organic that that will never, I don't see that changing. I just don't see that changing. But I see there's these wonderful technologies. How do we bring people together with a sense of, yes, they're safe, and I want them to be environmentally sustainable and clean and healthy? I mean, is there a middle road to be found somewhere?
It's a great question, and I have not seen anybody propose this. I think it's, I think, although I guess I'm not totally confident that some of the kinds of things that Felicia's been talking about might actually wind up becoming compatible with organic, some of the gene-edited things. Although it's certainly true that the Europeans have already decided that those are GMOs, and some of the major organic organizations have already decided that they're not going to have anything to do with it. But the middle road is, it's intriguing. It's an unexplored territory, and it's partly unexplored because nobody's figured out how to make money at it. And I think that given what we've already said about kind of the general public's degree of engagement with their food, the food industry is not anxious to make things any more complicated than they already are. They're already dealing, we've been talking about organic and GMO-free, and, gluten-free's come up, but we've also got, fair trade. We've got, my favorite is bird-friendly. You actually could, for a while, buy bird-friendly coffee. I haven't seen any in a while. But, there have been a number of things that have been kind of floated, but, it seems like the public's ability to take on more complex labels, maybe getting saturated. And it's a tough, it'll be, fascinating, but it's a tough thing to imagine how that's going to happen.
I think also, if you just think about some of the issues that we talked about with labeling, if the label is voluntary, you always have a food that will have it and a food that won't, because some company chose to pay more money for that label, right? So you still, even if the label is totally accurate, you still create a system where people think, oh, well, that one doesn't have it and it must be dangerous for me. So there's still just an inherent sort of ethical problem with that, if you will.
Right.
So that's a problem if it's voluntary, but then mandatory labels are only if they're of importance to the consumer, right? Is the how it's legally defined. So,
but we also have the other part of the mix on labels is that you can't forget that I think you can still buy food that's labeled as grown in Michigan, for example, and there are probably people that, I would buy that, wouldn't we all buy that instead of grown in Indiana, I lived in Indiana. I'd much rather have Michigan food. And then we have the kosher and halal, and certainly we know from research that people do associate safety with kosher and halal. And, having somebody come in and bless your food, maybe it makes it safer, but I'm not totally convinced myself. So there is a lot of complexity out there, and I have joked over the years that the years that I spent in Texas, I do want my hot sauce made in Texas, not New York City. So you get into some of the cultural things that I think are originally organic was kind of proposed as more of a cultural label, but that sort of got watered down or changed as it became mainstream, and it's just a big space that's constantly changing and very difficult to navigate.
Let me give the other perspective, the counter perspective of this, because I love this idea. Mostly because those are the sorts of things that I would love to eat, right? As organic practices with the biotech foods. So, but my question is, which comes first, the label or, you know, or the partnership, right? Because labels usually are there to respond to consumer demand or safety or something like that, but often consumer demand. And so, you know, part of the question would be, can we get these groups to be involved together, and does that grow a demand? If so, then I think you'd have more of a chance of getting a label to back that than to say, well, we're going to create a label, we're going to create a pathway, and then try to get people to come to it. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem.
But consumers already think they have that label.
They do.
They think the non-GMO label is that label.
Or
And
the-
organic,
the
or the
organic is
organic,
that
and they
label.
think that that is the only way to have environmentally sustainable, safe food.
And I think that's why you probably need people to come together to have the research to make the products that people like, and then, you know, educate people on why this is safe, why this is, I think it all comes down to education. I think a lot of it comes down
Yeah.
to education. And then that may grow some demand for some of these sorts
I also think a recognition that what food with the label you buy doesn't so much matter which label it is. We all need to eat more fruits and vegetables. I mean, that's what all the data shows, is we are not getting enough fruits and vegetables. And if you eat more fruits and vegetables, you mitigate a lot of the risks of your exposures.
Right.
Across the board in every epidemiological study ever done on nutrition. So just eat more fruits and vegetables.
I think you have all of us in the room thinking about how we're doing on that. At least
Yes.
I am. And I also know we have some people in the room who specifically work in the space of science and the public and some of these related issues. So if anyone wants to speak to their perspective on some of these, please don't hesitate. But what other questions do we have?
So we talked about labels. Which came first, the label or the demand?
Depends on which label you're talking about. Certainly with the bioengineered label, it was the demand. Because the bioengineered label is still in progress. It's something that's been demanded. I think gluten-free, I think probably demand. A lot of times it's demand. Trying to think of something where the label might have come first.
Well, in some cases, it's
Organic.
regulation, like how much phosphorus, how much protein, how much carbs. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
think that people started out demanding that, but it was a requirement
Right.
to.
I'm thinking the absent claim labels like no RBSC, no hormone free. So is that, to me, that was generated to create differentiation in the market.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, with mine. I think a lot of labels did that.
Yeah. A lot of labels come about because people want to know about different practices. And so whether that be a safety practice or just a what can I have, what do I have in my, do I have gluten, do I have whatever, you know, so a lot of it is demand driven.
And some industries are pretty smart and savvy that way. They look to see what people are concerned about in their food, or what's kind of the biggest news scare, and they say, okay, well, no, we don't have it in our product. Like you had
Marketing.
said earlier, Jenny, even if like dried apricots, you know, there are no genetically modified apricots in the US, but if you can label GM free on a package of dried apricots, you're golden.
There's also, in the past few weeks, I've learned of 3 new labels that companies can pay to have on their food. There is an autism safe label that I can guarantee is 100% BS. That's a whole other topic, because you don't get autism from your food. The other one was like some sort of clean food label.
I heard a little about
It's
that.
affiliated with the autism
Right.
safe
You can
label.
also, by the way, buy clean cosmetics because it's doing so well on the food products. They've transitioned away to other things.
I actually have a friend, and she's really proud that she works for a company like that. And I just,
Multi-level marketing is a whole other topic. that touches
and then
into
the other one, there's labels now for foods that specifically don't have glyphosate residues
That's not surprising.
because of all the news about that.
Yeah, I guess I mean, I am sort of the outlier here because I just see a lot of this as operating in the same space as advertising, right? My favorite label is melts in your mouth, not in your hand. That's what I want, something
that's
that
not
melts in
how-
your mouth, not in your hand.
But that's not how most consumers see the labels, I think.
Well, you know, what do they, I mean, people buy branded products. And I think there's research that suggests that people think branded products are higher quality and safer. You know, this has been going on for hundreds of years. You know, and you know, we have, you know, it sort of, the government's moved in and out of this space and tried to regulate it, but they've often had to back off just because, you know, people are going to believe what they're going to believe, and then, you know, they're going to go out and get what they want to get. My position is named after this guy named W.K. Kellogg, who came up with some pretty nifty advertising techniques to get people to buy those flaked field corn nuggets, and you know, they were health foods. You know, they were health foods back in the day, and that's how they were marketed. So, you know, I just kind of see that space as, it's part of our culture, and we ought to just learn to live with it. It's not an attack on science.
I think a lot of this gets to the ethics of labeling, I mean, and marketing and advertising just generally. I mean, you think about labels, and you've got really two distinct types of labels. You've got government mandated labels, like you look at the back of your food and what are the calories and the sodium and all of that. The BE label is going to be government mandated. But then on the other hand, you have things like this GMO free mark, or now autism free or safe or whatever, where you pay somebody to put the mark on there. And that looks a lot more like advertising, because that's not government regulated in any real way. And so consumers don't know the difference between those. They see a label and they think it means something. And it does mean something, it just may mean something very different depending on the type of label it is.
Well, and if the label perpetuates misunderstanding what that is,
Yes.
and then that trickles up to public support for research and funding, and ultimately where that technology is used, and whether or not it reaches people who maybe need it for other reasons, just for sustenance. So
Yeah.
I think there's kind of the global picture, and then sure, if an individual wants to avoid certain things, that doesn't harm anyone, that's their absolute choice. But whether public understanding matters in more broad terms, in some ways it probably does. But there's some more questions here.
Hi, so I have a question / comment, and some of you toured my lab earlier today, so obviously I am pro transgenic food and GMO technologies, but I think one of the conversations that I'd like to hear, and it's approaching the witching hour, so I won't expect a lot of comments, but one of the end goals here of using technology, biotechnology, bioengineering, genetically modified, whatever you want to call it, is to make food more accessible for the rest of the world. 25,000 people die every day because they don't have access to food. Dying of hunger, 25,000. So in 2 days, MSU would be dead. In 3 days, 4 days, East Lansing would be gone. So I think, you know, one of the middle roads here is to look at this like computers. Computers can be used for very bad things, but you don't ban the computer. You ban the application, you criticize or you critique the mechanism. And so, you know, I've learned a lot today, actually. You know, I didn't consider the impact of GMO on allergens and allergenicity and carcinogenicity, et cetera. But I think in terms of labeling all the foods and all the technologies, it is just a technology. I would argue, I guess I would argue against a couple of you, is that I think all food is genetically modified. We're talking specifically about transgenic food or biotechnology to create food. But I argue that food is all genetically modified. We're all genetically engineered. We're all genetically modified. Our parents got together and made us, for lack of a better way of explaining it. So I think one of the end goals we haven't talked about here is how are we going to feed the world, 25,000 people a day?
So the SciMoms, we have written on these kind of topics a lot. I think all those articles are on Medium. But we've written a lot about how the very conversation about GMO prevents us from having productive conversations at every level about important issues in our food system. So everyone wants to, we've we've conflated GMOs with a lot of very real issues, and the focus on GMOs has distracted us from some very important issues, and because banning GMOs would not solve any single one of those problems. So,
Complicated.
what?
When did food get so complicated?
I don't know, I just want to eat it.
So,
So true.
go ahead.
Okay, so just to highlight, people dying, there have been countries that have turned away food aid because it contained GMO foods. And it's like, even if you think that it's not good on a day-to-day basis, obviously people are not dying mass scale from it. Why would there are people who are so anti-GMO that they would turn away the food aid for people who are dying?
And then you have to consider why are people in those countries against it,
Against
and
it.
there's the action of NGOs that are deliberately telling people this food will kill you, and then people are starving.
But I think you can ask that question differently too. You could ask, why did the U.S. decide to send GMO food to a country when they knew people wouldn't accept it? We actually don't send yellow corn to countries where they don't eat yellow corn. We send white corn to countries where they eat white corn. We pay attention to a lot of cultural preferences in our food aid, and yet we decided, hell with you, we're going to force this GMO food down your mouth whether you want it or not. And I think that's just as legitimate a question with respect to that episode.
So 2 thoughts about your very important comments, Brad. First, in agreement with you, I mean, if you're talking about food security, global food security, and there's 2 things to consider in that aspect, and that one is yield and production, and the other is food distribution and equity. When I started my work in BT corn, this was in the 1990s, we had just introduced BT corn. We were producing less than 100 bushels per acre in the United States of corn during that time. Now, it's over 200 bushels per acre. And it's close to 100% BT and Roundup Ready corn. The yield has increased enormously, and compared with when USDA statistics started on this in 1866, I mean, there was hardly any increase until about 2000, and then it jumped up more than twice. So there is a lot of promise as far as yield, as far as food production. But then there are so many other factors that determine food security, that everybody is able to get the food that they need. Among them is food distribution. Among them is land tenure, who actually owns the crops that they are producing in different parts of the world. These are huge problems in many parts of the world, in many less developed countries. Do they actually get to keep what they own? Do they sell the best food and then keep the worst for themselves because they care more about spending that dollar on education, on clothes, on medicine? There are many, many different aspects of food security that just focusing on GMOs is not going to get to all of those issues of preventing 25,000 people from dying every day.
So one of the things that I've seen in research is a lot of low-income people don't buy fruits and vegetables because they can't afford the organic, and they think that the traditional or conventional produced is laced with pesticides. And how do we get this message to them? I mean, plants generate their own pesticides, and that's by far the larger amount that we receive than what we actually spray on the plant. But yet groups like EWG, which Alison is very familiar with, tell people that they ought to have this list of dirty dozen and figure out what you shouldn't be buying because these plants actually were oversprayed or whatever and have pesticide residuals. So how do we help people get past that roadblock in terms of buying fruits and vegetables?
We need to have a counter EWG with slick graphics from well-funded funders to get that information out. I mean, that's what we try to do. Like, we have a lot of stuff debunking that kind of information at SciMoms, but we don't have the budget of EWG. So, like, we get shared by a few thousand people on Facebook, but I don't think we're reaching the people who need it most.
I think it's a hard thing because the psychology of risk is that if you can eliminate a risk completely, you're willing to overpay to do that. Almost all of us do that.
How about the law of diminishing return?
Well, it's not rational. I'm not saying it's rational. I'm just saying we do it. And I've started driving 2 blocks out of my way on my way to work just because I don't like making a turn at one particular intersection, right? And I am so much happier on my morning commute, right? I won't pretend that that was a rational decision, but I've just eliminated that problem from my daily commute. And I think that, you know, what you're talking about with respect to people who are concerned about, I mean, you know, going through the thing that sort of got us to this sense of thinking about the various mutagens and carcinogens and so on in our food, a lot of which are natural. You know, you sort of are going through this balancing sort of thing, and there's no zero risk, right? You know, you're just sort of trying to play the probabilities, and if you have a conversation about playing the probabilities, and then somebody else says, you can just eliminate that. Here's the dirty dozen. You know, human psychology is a lot of people are going to go for that simple decision, I think, and I don't know what you do to get beyond that. I have this conversation at home with my wife, and I always lose. You know, it is. I mean, in some respects, the more responsible thing would be to try to. I mean, I think this is. You're going to see where my politics are now, but I would say it's just, you know, really trying to make that food more accessible to people and not putting them in a position where they have to make that kind of choice.
The other thing is, you know, it is about risk, right? And you can frame it as, you know, one risk versus another, but in the end, people have limited time when they're going in to buy something, and they're going to make a decision. They're not going to sit there and think, well, is it riskier for my kid not to have this versus having this? I mean, unless you have the luxury, you know, of time, which very often you don't. If you are rushing to catch a bus because you can't afford a car or what have you, right? Like you're trying to make ends meet. And so it's a bigger problem than just how do we get people to understand risk. It's how do we get them to integrate what that risk is, not on a broader scale. How do we reduce fear so that people can make more rational choices?
My name is Bob Roth. I'm a faculty member here at MSU, a toxicologist actually. And I think maybe my question really was sort of touched on, but it seems to me, and the comment you made about the DNA in the poll was, I think, really telling that we are really failing in terms of educating the public. And I guess I'd like to hear a little more on that. My own personal opinion is that we need to start maybe even at the elementary school level and get people to understand at an early age that there are things like thresholds. I mean, that's something that we haven't talked about at all here today, but you know, our food is very, very safe, and anything that's in it, for the most part, is below any kind of threshold that is going to cause toxicity, and yet we don't seem to be good at conveying that to the general public, and I'm not sure where to start or how to do it, but it's, I think, a tremendous frustration, at least for me.
So this is kind of where in the movie started from this, like who's having this conversation in the public? And it's celebrities and celebrities and more celebrities and
Bots too.
What?
Twitter bots.
And Twitter bots. Twitter bots and celebrities are talking about these issues in the public, and that's who the public is reading, and a variety of AstroTurf organizations. So people, and then they're having things shared in mommy groups. So scientists have not been a part of this conversation. I think that's a large part of the problem, and that's how you ended up with like Jenny McCarthy being the go-to person for news people to talk to about vaccines, because scientists were not a part of that public conversation. So even if behind the scenes scientists are talking to policymakers, that's great, but for the public conversation, that hasn't happened, and I think it's really important that scientists do that.
Yeah, I would add to that. You know, most Americans can't even name a scientist, and it's old data, but when they do, they come up with people like Al Gore and Bill Gates. Not exactly the kind of scientists that we have here today, and we've been talking about With the polling, something we see that I was quite surprised by is when we do include these literacy questions, the groups that get the answer wrong most are millennials, generally the most educated, the most affluent, and I think that has a lot to do with who we trust and who we get our information from. And what we see in polling too is when we ask where people go for information on food and health, they're turning to social media and they're turning to friends and family. And way down the list, they're looking at they can't even access most academic papers because they're behind a paywall if they wanted to, but they're not talking to scientists. They don't know scientists. So I think so much of the solution is building trust, and some of what Doug was saying earlier, for the scientists to listen a little bit more to what these concerns are and build a relationship. And that's not easy.
And we need to speak differently to the public than we speak to other scientists, because scientists speak a very strange language that we all understand, but regular people don't understand. So learn, like, when you write a paper, like, it's behind a paywall, but I don't understand scientific papers outside of my field necessarily. So how would someone who's not a scientist understand any of that? So, like, presenting that to the public in a digestible way, what does this paper mean? What does it mean in the larger picture of the whole field instead of just that one paper as well is also, I think, really important.
And recognizing, we keep doing this. Okay, go ahead.
So Bob, you pose a really interesting question, and this isn't really an answer, it's just an observation that many times scientists tend to be more reactive rather than proactive when it comes to engaging with the public about some of these fears. Because thinking about the example Alison brought up of vaccines, I think the scientists in the room, for example, we never thought to communicate that vaccines were safe because we assumed that everybody thought, as we did, that vaccines were safe. It wasn't until somebody brought up the concern that suddenly we had to be in that reactive position. And how can we become proactive versus reactive about some of these fears that are brought up? It's really hard to, that's a really tough question.
I think as someone who's spent most of my career in research, it's hard to know how to be proactive. It's hard to know how do you get your foot in the door. I'm still not sure I have a good feel for that.
You could write for SciMoms.
SciDad.
Or have your own blog. So one thing I think is to keep in mind too is that we really seem to live in a very polarized society these days. And some of the, and you've got like the anti-vaxxers want to pit themselves against the scientists, or the anti-GMOists want to pit themselves against the scientists. And what we should be conveying is that we're not trying to be against these other groups. We're trying to figure out what the risks are and what we can do to help. And so be careful of playing into that stereotype.
Well, and so when I talked earlier, I talked about the two main things of being honest and recognizing that people's concerns are valid. The other piece of that is finding your shared value. Yeah. So why are people anti-vaccine? Because they are concerned for the safety of your children. And even though I believe in vaccines and I believe the scientific consensus, I can have a shared value with that person that we are both concerned about doing what is the safest, best thing to set our child up to have a good life.
We're all concerned about food safety. We all have to eat. Right?
Yeah, and just I am getting to it in a different way. But I think that's the third piece of that.
We've got more questions back here.
Yeah, there were some more questions from over here.
Wherever.
So I think you've kind of touched a little bit on it, but where do you think the concern or the fear originated over GMOs?
Well, I can tell you that when, back in 1986, when I was, at Texas A&M and somebody started talking about inserting genes through this new mechanism, my reaction was, boy, I bet there's a bunch of stuff that can go wrong with that. And, that just strikes me as kind of a common sense reaction, right? So, I don't think that it's hard to figure out where the fear comes from. But you do need to understand a little more about how it works, and you need to understand that, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with ordinary plant breeding. That's one of the things that I didn't know as you know, how bad ordinary plant breeding can go wrong and how come we don't all die from that. Well, you know, it's because people that are doing it know what they're doing and they take precautions and they check to make things have worked right, and we do have a regulatory system. But it's not it's you know, when you're sort of operating in a vacuum of, you know, kind of the professional ethics of the potato breeders for, you know, and the way that the regulatory structure is working, it's very reasonable to be worried about this kind of stuff, I think. And so, you know, this sense of, you know, not knowing, I mean, food is something that we put into our bodies several times a day, and we don't do it like we do drugs because we're sick. You know, it's not, you know, I don't actually think that this was something that was kind of created as a conspiracy. I think that it originated with people who had legitimate questions, and I think for a good decade there was nobody answering those questions. And I think that we also had episodes like the food aid thing, where people were, that was a case of literally, you know, somebody at some level of government had this idea that, you know, we're going to force this GMO corn down the African's throat in order to prove a point against Europe, because it was the Europeans that were not accepting it. Well, it got, you know, there was a kind of politics dimension to that. And that didn't help the acceptance of GMOs either. So there are, you know, 2 or 3 episodes like that, you know, where I think, you know, we kind of blew it in the early days, particularly on the science communication piece. And so it's not surprising to me that you have this natural kind of curiosity that can easily go in the direction of concern. And if you're operating without any better sources of information, you're very vulnerable to people. I will say, let me just add one more thing. I don't want to talk too long on this, but you know, there are some legitimate concerns, right? So, you know, GMOs were coming on the market. They'd actually get on the market until the late 90s, but they were being talked up and researched right at the point when we were going through the most dramatic farm crisis in the United States. We lost half of our farmers in the 1980s. And so there was this big concern that we don't want technologies that are going to put farmers out of business. And we had seen some mechanical technologies that had done precisely that. So there was this kind of concern that was out there in the farm country. This is very relevant for the discussion of BST, because there were studies that suggested that when BST goes on the market, you know, we're going to lose half our dairies. I think those studies were probably wrong, but it was out there, right? So this was coming out of the dairy industry, right? And so you started getting people that were attacking GMOs because they didn't feel like there was any attention being given to what was taking place in rural America. You know, the loss of all the farmers and the closure of all the post offices and all the school systems and all the Main Street businesses. I mean, we're still dealing with that. So I think that some groups said, nobody's listening to us about this, so we're going to start screaming about GMOs. And that may be a way we can get some attention, and you know, maybe some small farmers can start growing organics, and that's an alternative way to survive. It sort of goes back to that divide that I was talking about earlier, that you know, people who were interested in those farmers that couldn't produce or sell at a scale where they could, you know, survive with commodity production, started lining up on these alternative methods and trying to figure out some way to stay in business. And you know, having people scared about the food system was a way to sort of move things. Wasn't the most rational way to move things, but many of the big ag organizations, many of the big commodity organizations weren't helping these small guys in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm not sure they're helping them even now. So those are, I think that it's a natural curiosity plus an activist community that was very frustrated that there were no government levers, there were no policy levers for the kind of changes that were taking place in rural America.
I'll also add to the rural America piece is that most of these GMOs, as they come out, have been patented. which means that when they get sold, they cost more, and you can't save seed, which back in the early 1900s and the 80s was a big part of rural America's traditions, was I'll save some of my seeds for next year. And so there was a huge pushback against these GMOs from those perspectives as well. So uptake wasn't as great there.
But that's also a bit of a scientific misunderstanding, because GMOs are put into hybrid seeds, so you wouldn't save any hybrid seed,
Well, you
which
could
is
save your
also
soybean seeds.
Yeah, I mean,
Can you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just the hybrids.
So, but it's not, my point is that it's not exclusive
not all,
to,
yeah.
so like, that's again one of these conflation things, right? Like,
Right.
that's an issue related to hybrid, it's not specific to GMO. So that's a
Right.
place where people have said, oh, this is a GMO-specific issue, but you would still have that issue
Right,
if you ban GMOs.
right.
So that it's
Yeah, I mean,
it's displacing it's
yeah,
taking a real concern,
Yes.
like a real concern, and saying, this is the boogeyman, and if you ban this, it will fix your real concern, when in fact it won't.
Yeah, the hybrid issue goes back for decades before the GMOs. But the GMOs really, for the people who had been
Yeah.
saving seeds,
Yeah.
it was a big thing.
Yeah.
Well, we have time for probably about 2 more questions. So there's
Somebody
some folks
back, these
here.
people back
She
there
had
have
a
really
question
been
a
trying
long
to get
time
in.
ago.
Maybe we can squeeze in 3.
All right. So I'm just wondering how you were talking about how you were ready to address the issue of misinformation with millennials. I don't even know if I'm a millennial or what. I was born in 1996, so I think I'm Gen Y. But all I know is that I grew up in an era when the computer went from this giant box to a little box, and suddenly there was information overload. You couldn't take 2 steps without getting more information. I'm wondering if any of this talk will honestly reach anybody that is a millennial right now, because, well, look around us right now. There are very few students here. This isn't their type of information, but it's good information. I mean, think about it. This is the way that dialogues happened in the past. This is what created wisdom, and this is what made people start to think for themselves and synthesize information. It's what made people scientists, is the need to know more information. They have it all now, and so, all the information, and so because they have so much of it, they can't filter it anymore, and it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
So they won't pick stuff up like this. I'm sorry, but nobody on this campus would pick this up. So I'm wondering if it also has to be a social change. You talked also about a divide in the country. I think that the information overload has exacerbated the problem. I don't know how exactly, but when you have a lot of people spit-firing very mean things, you're bound to have people take sides. So I'm hoping that, and what I hope, this is my perspective, is that we keep having dialogues like this for the benefit of MSU students, and that eventually more come. But I'm wondering if you think that there's another way to address the issue of information overload, because it's not going to go away. I think we need to make ourselves more credible and make ourselves more of a regular thing. But what do you think?
So this is exactly what led to Natalie deciding to create the Science Moms documentary, and it's what we talk about every day in our SciMom Slack chat. Like, how do we create a community, mostly online, but also in our personal communities, where we can have these conversations? And so the movie closes with, I think, Layla, who's also a molecular biologist, says something like, this movie is the beginning of a conversation. So like we try really to curate on our page like a community where people feel safe to ask questions and people share information, and we're very careful about our tone, and we're trying to be fun and creative in how we share that, because I'm not going to write a scientific paper and expect that the mom at the bus stop wants to read that. I might try to share a clever infographic or something. And so we've done a lot with graphic design because that's how things get shared online. It has to have a neat graphic or it doesn't get shared. So we have to use the technology that the people we want to reach are using in a way that will get shared on Instagram and Pinterest and however people are sharing information.
Let me just,
So-
oh, go ahead.
I actually don't think there is an easy answer to the wonderful questions that you bring up. We are becoming a more divided society, and it doesn't help that we have smartphones with us all the time. We don't even stand in a grocery line and just think for ourselves, what do we really think about particular issues? We have to be seeing what everybody else is thinking about particular issues. And it's not just about food safety, not just about GMOs, but about politics, about climate change, about everything. And
I don't know if the solution is another infographic. I don't know if we need another web page. We don't need it. No one is going to click on it anyway because there's so much of it out there. No one knows who to trust.
Our feedback from our followers is that they really enjoy our information and that they're taking it to their schools. I've had lots of people ask, can I come to speak to their kids' class? You were talking about education. So I think that if you are communicating in a different, innovative way, you might break through that. And like, we don't have like data, but we have.
We do have data. Like,
No,
I'm going to tell
like
you.
we as Sci Moms don't have the
Okay.
data, but like I have all the anecdotes of all the people who are like, thank you so much for this information. I don't know where to turn to it, and your site has, like, people tell us that we've literally changed how they.
But they are
navigate
self-selected.
this. They are
to be fair.
self-selected, but like, they now have that information, and then when it comes up in their community, they go out and they have that dialogue with their friend, like, oh, I'm not worried about GMOs anymore because I learned X, Y, and Z. And so it has to just kind of make its way out through the culture in a way.
So
Go ahead.
what I would say is to echo what Alison's saying is we. And I don't mean we as the panel, I mean we as everybody in this room and who has heard this online. It's not about more graphics, unless that's what you do. Maybe you do graphics, then do graphics. Maybe you start a site or a group. Great, start a site or a group. Maybe you just tap the person on the shoulder in the grocery line and say, hey, I see what you're reading, can we talk about it?
Oh, that's probably
Right?
not a good idea.
I mean, that's a little creepy, don't do that. But I mean, like, I think what we do is different for all of us. Some of us have specific passions. We're rooted by different things, and so we have to figure out what works for us. But we all have to take the mantle on us to have the conversations, even if we're having the conversations in different ways with different people.
Okay, I'm being told that we have to start wrapping up, but I want to speak to this real briefly, and I'm going to tell you why I'm optimistic, because I think it's good to leave on an optimistic note anyway, but I really am. I was born in 1980. If you want to go by NPR standards, millennials start at 1982, and I feel a little better about that, but I love millennials too. When I was in grad school, there was no science communication in my degree. I wanted to go into science policy. There were not many avenues to do that, and generally I was told that my trajectory was to be a tenure-track professor. That's not what I did. I found other tools and other ways to tell stories, and my career hasn't been traditional by any stretch of the imagination. But I think a lot of us are moving in that interdisciplinary space. I've consulted at many universities now to help them build programs that cross these disciplinary lines. And I think the fact that there are fewer and fewer tenure-track jobs available, but more and more people with expertise to apply that expertise in different spaces, to work in places like Capitol Hill, where when I was there were very few scientists navigating what those conversations would be like, but now there are even more than ever that want to enter that style of using their expertise to inform policymaking, science journalism, science communication, like all of these things we've done. Besley here, he's a great guy to talk about this with. These programs are exploding. MSU's been trying to train faculty to communicate beyond talking to each other. How do you talk to journalists? How do you talk to policymakers? How do you talk to kids? So I think that there's a real recognition that this is necessary, and this is important, and we all have different strengths and different styles of communication, but we can all be effective where we're comfortable. Yeah.
Can I add one? The communication is one important part. We also have to teach people how to think for themselves.
Critical thinking.
How to take all the information and really arrive at their own logical, rational conclusions. And I think that's the flip side of communication. That really, I don't know if that addresses the original point that you brought up, but I think that that's something that also needs to be raised.
And don't be afraid to move outside of your original comfort zone when you're thinking about these things. My PhD's in microbiology, and then I went to law school. And so this gets back to that non-traditional pathway. I did not want to stay at the bench, but I love science, and this was the way I found to do it. And that lets me be a lot more effective at a broader level than I would have, I think, for me, if I'd have been at a bench for all of my career. Because that's my personal preference. So think about what all of your skills are as you're going out.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we've got to end this conversation, and I know we didn't get to a ton of questions, but we'll probably be hanging out for a bit, and we'd love to chat more. So thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.